and welcome to this special podcast takeover from Amsterdam Dance Event 2022, where I was really lucky to be on the ground capturing insights with several industry leaders from label owners, artists, investors, founders, promoters, journalists, and many, many more. ADE is the largest dance music gathering in the world for professionals and fans alike, and it takes place over 5 days with 600 speakers, 2,500 artists, 1,000 events, and 450,000 visitors from around the globe. And after 3 really hard years for our industry, it was honestly incredible to connect again with stakeholders in the music ecosystem and discuss urgent topics such as sustainability for live events, mental health for artists and professionals, social change, and strategies for the future of electronic music. The dates have been announced for ADE 2023, and I already can't wait for next year. So today we're talking to Nico Perez, the CEO and co-founder of Mixcloud, which has grown to become a major music platform over the last 15 years with over 17 million unique visitors a month. And his journey in growing Mixcloud has been super lean. The investment space around music at the time, especially around music platforms, was very, very sensitive given the spectacular collapse of companies like Napster. And so Nico bootstrapped the business for several years, and he only really got funding in the last 5 years. His story is super inspiring for fellow founders, and he truly embodies what we like to call a mission maker on this podcast. So without further ado, let's dive straight into today's conversation. Nico, thanks so much for joining us on Mission Makers. It's a true honor to have you on the show today, and I'm so happy our paths crossed during ADE. How was ADE for you?
Yeah, so great to be here. Thank you for having me. ADE was super hectic in a good way. I haven't been to conference since before the pandemic, so it was sort of kind of getting back into that groove of meeting people, doing business meetings, going to events, going to parties, going to see all these new acts and people. So a lot going on in a short couple of days, but it's always kind of like energizing to see so much happening.
What were some of the key takeaways that you've kind of observed that that people often say ADE is like the thermometer of the industry sometimes, especially around this time of year. So what were kind of some of the key things you observed?
Yeah, I think the kind of 2 big themes are sort of in some ways larger than even kind of dance or electronic music, which are kind of the metaverse and Web3. So that sort of percolated through a couple of the presentations I saw, and then also just kind of in conversations with the people I met. People are thinking about these things, ultimately trying to think about like where the future is going, how our industry and kind of now the wider technology industries are going to evolve. So we obviously saw at the kind of end of, I think it was a Thursday or Friday, we saw Richie Houghton demo his kind of live mixing that's being pushed to a kind of blockchain platform, kind of mostly an experiment, but it was kind of cool to see people kind of pushing the envelope.
Yeah, I think we're obviously, still quite a few years away from like full adoption, and it's right now that like what I think is so interesting about ADE is like people come, they get inspired, they see other people doing things, and it's kind of like it's just like this kind of experimental playground, and obviously so many like events and promoters and artists are there, and it's a complex topic, obviously Web3 and metaverse, and we'll definitely talk about what Mixcloud has planned with some of these transitions. But of course, talking about Mixcloud, you're the co-founder and CEO of such a interesting platform. And you've had quite a lean journey with Mixcloud. I learned that you only took funding until 10 years after you founded the company. And that's quite commendable and inspiring for many founders who I know listen to this show. So tell us a little bit more like about that journey, about that decision to not take funding until so late on in the game, and also what, if the vision has evolved around Mixcloud since the early days.
Yeah, so I think we're relative rarity in that sense that we didn't take funding for a very, very long time. And, part of it was by design, by choice, and part of it was kind of by necessity. So when we first started out, we pitched quite a few investors, quite a few VCs and startup accelerators and things like that. And, in the early days, we didn't really have a product. We hadn't really built anything. So the kind of general feedback was like, come back to us once you build something. And then, we built it, and got some users, and then the general feedback was like, okay, come back to us when you got some revenue. And so we were pitching people early on, and then we sort of got to a place where we started to generate some revenue, and we were, not profitable, but like we were not, so unprofitable that we couldn't survive. And that actually helped us really focus on, just thinking about the underlying business model, and kind of making sure that we weren't taking an approach, which I've seen other companies and platforms take, of like scale first, think about the business model later.
Mm.
So I think that was overall like a good thing for us as a company. And we actually turned down at one point an investment offer because we just didn't think it was a good fit for us. So that was the first 10 years. In about 2018, in fact, just a little bit before that, the kind of way that we licensed the platform went from a kind of blanket radio style license to a more direct deal with some of the major record labels. And those deals generally require a larger sum of cash upfront. So in order to be able to afford that and pay for that, we basically decided, okay, we do need to raise some funding. And that was essentially our Series A raise from a firm called Wonderco on the West Coast, which is some folks who were ex-Dropbox, some folks who set up DreamWorks, and then a chap named Anthony Soleil, who's on our board, who manages Nas and Kendrick Lamar.
Mm. And so appreciate if you can't share this information, but do you feel like there would be need for further rounds or not really?
It's a good question. We've been thinking about it, but at the same time, it's also right now not the right climate. If you look at everything pretty much like across the board, so many stocks have gone down, like, reading about Facebook or Meta and Amazon, Spotify, Netflix, like everybody is down, 40, 50, 60+%. And so it feels like the economic climate has changed. There is much more, because governments printed so much money during the pandemic, and inflation has gone up. And so to kind of balance that out, they need to raise rates. So the cost of capital is no longer as cheap as it once was. So the cost of fundraising becomes more expensive. And so there's all these kind of knock-on effects, which means that right now our focus is kind of really focusing on getting to that break-even point, getting to that point where, we can generate a profit and actually be self-sustaining as a platform.
And so talking about, that kind of journey, like sometimes, finding that co-founder is one of the hardest parts in the beginning, especially. So what was like that journey like? I think you met your co-founder in the same university that you were studying in, which I know what you studied is not necessarily relevant or applicable to what you're doing today. But yeah, what was that kind of journey like? And like, do you have any advice for like other founders out there in terms of, finding that dream partner?
Yeah. So I study aeronautical engineering, which on the face of it has nothing to do with, DJ mixes and radio shows and music. But basically music was always a passion at university. And that's actually how I met one of our co-founders, Nikhil Shah, was through he created a hip hop society. I created a breakdancing society back in the day. And one of the other co-founders, Sam Cook, actually met through breakdancing. And then the fourth co-founder, Matt Clayton, we actually met after university, but we had a mutual friends, and he went to the same kind of Cambridge University as us. But it was through a friend of a friend that we met him. And it was an interesting way that we started working together, which I can highly recommend to anybody who's thinking about doing a startup. And that was the concept of a skill swap. So when we started, I was actually doing a lot of the design work on Mixcloud, and we needed a back-end kind of developer, engineer, kind of CTO type. And so Matt was also working on his own separate project to do with kind of web ticketing, something kind of similar to Eventbrite. And so we agreed to kind of swap skills, and I would do design for him and he would help out doing kind of some of the back end architecture and coding for us. And we did that for about 6 to 9 months. And it's a really good way to sort of test out a working relationship. Because I think a lot of the challenge of, starting a startup is like, you kind of don't, unless you've worked with somebody before, you don't really know what it's like to work with them day to day. So that was a really good way of us kind of testing that out, seeing if it worked. And then eventually, kind of after about a year or so, both services had kind of pretty much launched, but it became clear that there was kind of more momentum behind Mixcloud. There was more people using it. It was kind of spreading quicker. And so just kind of we naturally gravitated towards Mixcloud as a kind of core key project. So overall, I think it was a really healthy way to kind of try out a relationship.
Yes, there's been many great businesses launched from college dorm rooms, as they say.
Yeah.
And what I find quite interesting, but yeah, unsurprising about your company is that like many people in your team are DJs themselves and artists. And that obviously means that you understand like the key problem that you're trying to solve for your community, right? And like maybe even in quite an early sort of like earlier than most, right? So what are some of the things that you're focusing on at the moment to kind of help level up the DJ community?
Yeah, 100%. I think having knowledge of the space where you're operating, and I guess ultimately kind of being your own end user, is so useful and powerful, because you just kind of, you get it, you kind of understand all the nuances and things like that. So in our case, what we've been working on a lot is essentially the way we think about Mixcloud as a platform is we want to power musical expression, help people build communities, and then ultimately generate an income from their passion. And so expression is kind of the foundational base layer. And we have in the past, for 10 years, given people the ability to upload DJ mixes and podcasts, and we clear the copyright and take care of all that side of things. In the pandemic, we launched live streaming as a kind of new format. And then just recently, about 2 weeks ago now, we introduced single tracks. So people who DJ, but maybe also perhaps are starting to produce their own music, can start to upload it and showcase it and host it under the same umbrella in the same home. So that is kind of how we're thinking about it in terms of like giving these people this platform in these ways to express themselves musically.
And with tracks, which was launched during ADE, so congrats on this evolution of the platform. With tracks, do you see that it will play an important role of like the kind of current the way that artists are treated at the moment with royalties and kind of how unfair those royalty splits are? Like, is there a plan for Mixcloud to kind of be a leader in that?
Yeah, 100%. So we kind of have pioneered a model whereby you can subscribe to an individual profile or individual channel. And so rather than the kind of traditional DSP model of like, essentially you take all the subscription revenue, put it in a pot, and then divide it based on everybody's listening overall, we are kind of much closer to this idea that like, if I was to subscribe to your channel, then it is fairer that revenue, the majority, lion's share of the revenue, goes to you as a creator. And so we are kind of building and pushing and kind of building out that model as an alternative to the kind of Spotify, Apple Music, Deezer model of like everything going into one pot and then being split by overall popularity. So, I think that it's a much more interesting model for artists and creators who have a very loyal, deeply engaged fan base. And it's kind of ultimately more flexible. It gives them a way to speak to that fan base directly. It gives them a way to kind of build up that community and ultimately kind of generate a living from what they're doing. So, our core mission, and we kind of, this is how we describe ourselves externally, is we're on a mission to try and make the music ecosystem more sustainable. And it really just isn't there yet. We've come a long way since the days of piracy, but there's still a lot of artists and musicians who don't really make enough from streaming.
And so would that mean that like label owners or would have to kind of have a relationship directly with the artist or have access to their Mixcloud accounts to know how much splits comes to those labels that are pushing out tracks, or own the copyrights, or like how would it work for those people?
So right now, the kind of single tracks feature is mostly based for independent DIY artists. So these are people who kind of, like my brother, or people like that who are kind of producing music at home and want to just get it out there and kind of showcase it. We are kind of exploring, talking to a few of the different labels and figuring out, how would it work for them. But ultimately, it has to come from the copyright owner. So if it's somebody who's not signed, if it's somebody who's kind of, DIY, then it's them who can kind of put it up and be the channel owner. If it's a label, then that could also be them. They would be then the kind of channel owner and the one to kind of be running it. So it really kind of depends on ultimately who is the owner of the copyright.
Hey, I hope you're enjoying today's show. And of course, if you are, a little review or share with your friends would be much appreciated. But I just want to take a quick pause to share some interesting news that Mission Makers has unexpectedly grown into becoming a boutique podcast agency. And for the last year and a half, we've secretly been producing content for some high-impact brands from tech unicorns in Silicon Valley to disruptive companies at Davos. So if you're thinking of starting your own show and you're looking for some help, then send us a message, because we would absolutely love to bring your story to life and help you amplify your content while really connecting on a much deeper level with your audiences. Now, let's get back to the show. Yeah, definitely. And so talking about expression, how are you guys kind of preparing for that transition to Web3?
It's a good question. I mean, I think it's a very polarizing topic. There are definitely some people who believe in it near religiously, and there's other people who near religiously don't believe in it. So I think what was interesting about a lot of the conversations at ADE was about how it has the potential to give artists more agency and ultimately more, let's call it interoperability between different platforms and services out there. So imagine a world in which you could actually take your Twitter or your Instagram following and bring that to Ticketmaster, Dice, Resident Advisor, and sell tickets that way, or bring it to Mixcloud and do a live stream for people who have bought one of your NFTs or hold one of your tokens or something like that. So I think that there is a lot of potential there, but I'm kind of happy that we've gotten through that stage last year where it felt like so hyped. And there was such a like crazy bubble that it sort of started to get like irrational exuberance, as the economists say.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, it's still a long way, and there's definitely a lot of hype. There's been a lot of crashes. There's been a lot of speculation, and time will only tell, just how far this can go. You spoke at ADE around the rapidly evolving world of streaming. What were some of the key takeaways from your session?
Yeah, so I spoke mostly to, a little bit to the past, because I think it's really important to kind of look at where we come from before trying to predict the future. Mm-hmm. And really, a lot of my talk was about looking at how the last 20 years or so, the last 2 decades, was in some ways a kind of different model where we've kind of moved from the ownership model to the access model, either first through piracy or then after that through traditional streaming services. And how I think that in the future, we are actually, through what blockchain as a technology unlocks, also through things like metaverse, where kind of you're creating a new virtual world, this idea of kind of ownership will resurface, but perhaps in a kind of different capacity. So what I mean by that is kind of the kind of fundamental nature of ownership prior to the year 2000 was really about ultimately kind of being able to listen to or play a piece of music, right? Like you would buy a vinyl, you would buy a CD in order to listen to it. Today, in this world, in this digital world that is like hyper networked, everybody is connected to everybody. There are these online communities that are forming. I think the nature of ownership will change slightly in such that it's less about kind of functional value of like, I'm going to hit play on this and be able to listen to it. And it has different types of value. So perhaps it has value related to status within a community. Like I support this artist. I've, owned and bought the first of every drop that they've done, or whatever it may be, or might possibly be more around access to the artists themselves. So if you purchase this track, you could potentially join in an AMA, Ask Me Anything sort of session. So I think that what is cool about how the technology is evolving is that we have these kind of network systems and communities and graphs of people. And so what the ownership means and can unlock is in some ways could be a lot more powerful and a lot more interesting in this kind of digital world.
Yeah, definitely. And so I'm sure you get asked this question a lot, but what kind of tips would you give to artists then to then leverage their Mixcloud and really hone in on their audience, get that community engaged through their Mixcloud accounts?
Yeah, so the number one tip that I give to everybody is consistency. What we've seen, like through all of the data that we look at, is that the people who are consistent, the people who build up a habit of doing either weekly, monthly, or quarterly uploads or radio shows or DJ mixes, those are the people who do well because they build up that audience, they build up that loyalty. Like if you do like 10 things in 1 week and then leave it for 10 months and don't do anything else, there isn't the same type of like loyalty and community that's built. So consistency is definitely number one. Number two is like take advantage of the tagging system that we have on the platform. So you can tag an upload with a primary genre. You can actually tag it with anything you want now. So take advantage of that and put in all the metadata and all the description and an image and all of these things, because it makes a difference. It helps people find it. It helps people discover what you're creating. And so don't be lazy about it. Don't just like upload the file and leave it as is. Actually put in a little bit of, you've done 99% of the work, so that last little 1% just to give it that discoverability.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think that's important tips. And I think, with anything, consistency is key. And like, especially when it comes to content, like humans are creatures of habit. They want to know, like, I can listen to John Digweed's show every like first Wednesday of the month or whatever it is. So yeah, having that consistency, I think is pretty key. And then obviously the platform offers so much in terms of metadata that you should just go out there and make sure. And it's also fair to the other creators who've made that music as well. It's like, to fairly recognize and credit those people too. So what do you think are like some of the misconceptions behind some of the work that you do?
Well, actually, to that last point you said, I think a lot of people don't fully realize the lengths and extents to which we go to help artists get paid when their music is played. So if you use a platform like Facebook or Twitch or many of the others, and you play music there, more often than not, pretty much all the time, the underlying artists are not receiving any royalties for that. So we're different. Whenever you live stream or upload anything to Mixcloud, we run our Content ID system on it. We figure out what tracks are in there. We figure out what labels on them. We figure out what artists created them. We figure out what songwriters wrote them. And then we have to figure out, okay, who do we pay for this in what country, over what time, and run a huge amount of like servers and computation and processes in the background that isn't necessarily visible to anybody in the front. And so there's a lot of like complexity there that is either misunderstood or people just aren't aware of it because you can't really see it. So that's something that we spent the best part of the last decade building and refining and improving. And so I'm really, really proud that we are pretty much one of the only platforms that can handle user-generated content with music and properly pay out rights for it.
How does that like kind of, impact the competition? Because like obviously your competition, like my personal opinion, but they don't necessarily go about it in the most fairest of ways, right? And there's obviously a lot of scrutiny around those platforms and the DSPs, and like even some of the conversations we've been having on this podcast have been like a lot of artists don't want to tour in the crazy ways they do, but they have to because that income doesn't come in from streaming. And therefore it just puts an enormous pressure on performance fees. And obviously we saw what happened in the pandemic when performances were taken out of the equation.
Yeah. I mean, I think that there's other larger, huge platforms out there that are owned by, these big kind of multinational tech companies. And ultimately for them, music is like quite a small part of what they do. And so they just don't give it the proper attention. And so what ends up happening is that as especially a DJ or radio presenter, if you're playing other people's music, you essentially kind of roll the dice. And if it gets picked up in their content ID systems, then chances are your stream or your upload will be taken down or muted or blocked. And, we see this time and time again. And everybody always asks me like, why don't they get the licenses? Why don't they do this? Like, why don't they do it properly? And, I just got to tell them like, maybe it's because they don't really care about you or about music that much, which is kind of like tough love, tough news. But I think that over time, the number of people who are aware of copyright as something that actually is important, actually deserves to be solved properly, is growing. And so I think over time, we've seen more and more people come to Mixcloud as a platform for that very reason.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you've seen, there's even a new show on Netflix about the journey of Spotify and some of the psychologies behind the founder and that whole journey, which is it's quite interesting, but it's also sad to see like, maybe something that might have happened to someone in their childhood, it affects billions of people around the world because of the way that they've designed their particular system. So yeah, and what do you think, in your opinion, is the single most important change that needs to happen in the music industry 1 year from now, 5 years from now, and 10 years from now?
This is a good question that I remember you asked me. And I'm going to wonder if I'm going to say the same thing. So I remember metadata, the importance of metadata was definitely one of the answers. I can't remember if it was 1 year or 5 years. But I think that asking or raising awareness around the importance of metadata and how, like, when you create a song, that's kind of half of the journey. But, and when I'm talking about metadata, I'm talking about beyond just the name, title, genres, things like that. I'm talking about ISRC code, ISWC code, the kind of underlying rights metadata that ultimately helps you get paid as an artist. So I think spreading that message, raising that awareness is super key. And I'd say like the 1 and 5 year timeline. In the like 10-year timeline, I think this I think there's like a growing awareness that there are different models out there that kind of work for different types of creators. And so, if you're a Drake or a Taylor Swift, like the major label model works really well. They have these promotion machines and you get distribution and you get all your music out there and it works really well. But if you're, let's say, an artist that has a smaller audience or following, let's say it's only like 5 or 10,000 people, major label model probably doesn't really work that well for you. And in fact, if you have a very loyal but smaller audience, a kind of direct relationship and there's this concept of 1,000 true fans.
Yeah.
That's kind of been around for a while, but like that model of like speaking directly to and generating income directly from those 1,000 true fans, I think has a lot more promise if you have that type of profile as an artist and a creator. So I hope that in the kind of like next 10 years, people recognize that there's not a kind of one size fits all single solution or approach as an artist.
Yeah, there definitely isn't. And that hopefully is some of the exciting elements around Web3, is to create value for each fan in a totally different way that's, you know, that can be generated through NFTs or different, basically different ways that isn't, you know, just based on a penny per play type thing. Final question is, what are the Mixcloud office parties like, and does your team get to see you DJ?
Yeah, I like to think they're pretty good. We I want to say like maybe 70% of us or so we DJ. We take turns, we kind of switch it up, and we actually host a quarterly party at a venue called Brilliant Corners, which is in Hackney in London. And so if anybody's listening to this and is based in London and would like to come down, we are doing our final one for the year on the 6th of December at Brilliant Corners. And yeah, it's all vinyl, which is kind of fun too, nice. Kind of like a retro kind of feel to it. And yeah, they're pretty good. Like, as you can imagine, most people are, you know, deep into their music. They have